keep in mind as we go through this lunch and learn today is there are utilities from multiple states that may be watching, as this information applies more than just Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. So just keep that in mind as we go through. We're going to cover a couple different topics today. We're going to go a little bit more in depth of what a utility required profile actually is. What the utility yourself are supposed to be doing with it, what we expect DER installers to be doing with the URPs. And then we're going to walk through a little bit about how it's handled in the actual interconnection process, specifically when it comes to the witness test or commissioning portion. Okay, so again, hold your questions until the end, and we'll go from there. So first off, all utilities that have a DER process should also have a technical requirement document that outlines the different settings that we are looking for in basically in conjunction with IEEE 1547. In 2018, IEEE 1547 was updated and it became a lot more expansive and talked about different categories, different settings for ride-through, and also how we would specifically like DERs to respond when abnormal conditions occur. In the Midwest, most of those settings are actually being dictated by the ISO in the region. So for most of Minnesota and portions of the Dakotas, MISO sets those standards. On the western half of the Dakotas, it might be SPP. Either way, in your technical requirements document, if you're in Minnesota, it's called your TSM, Technical Specification Manual. If you're in the Dakotas, it's probably just your technical requirements. Iowa and Wisconsin, you guys kind of vary. But there's going to be a section, if you work with STAR, towards the end of your technical requirements that outlines a summary of what all of those settings should be. And we specifically put it together for inverter-based type DER. So this is your storage and your solar, as that seems to be most prevalent at this current time. These different settings, I mean, there's a lot of them. It talks about when an inverter is supposed to come back into service after an outage. It talks about whether we're using constant power factor, volt var or volt watt when it comes to power control and how we want the inverters to react. It talks about what to do when frequency issues are occurring. And so typically at the end of your technical requirements, there's a chart that looks like this that kind of summarizes everything and it kind of put it into categories. Well, what makes it complicated is every inverter manufacturer is a little bit different, okay? They have different setting titles when they go into their program of what enter service might be for them. So the industry, led by EPRI, which is a think tank, created what's called a common language format. That's the URP, the Utility Required Profile. What that did is this format had all the manufacturers of inverters agree to what each setting should be named. So if you go look at a Fronius inverter and you compare it to another manufacturer's brand, they both will have a format that says enter service for voltage low will always be this. This is how we know it's like for like, so we can find where that setting actually is. So with that, that is one of the ways that this can be shared with utilities instead of getting screenshots from the inverter programmer. You know, when you go into the software of the inverter, we could get screenshots, but again, it's what they might say is enter service might be slightly different than what we're expecting to see. So using this common format of a utility required profile is the way for us all to speak basically in the same language. A URP is a CSV file, okay? That's the format it should be in when the utility provides it to installers and also when installers provide it to utilities. Same thing as manufacturers are able to export settings out, it's going to come in a CSV. There are two different files, okay? The utilities will provide a URP in a specified setting file. So we're going to provide in this common language, we're going to tell them these are the settings we expect to see. Okay, that file is called specified settings or URPSS. The installer then, prior to doing the actual interconnection of the DER, will provide to the utility a CSV file back. Okay, it's not going to be identical to what the utility provided, but they're going to provide back a URP that is called AS or applied settings. Okay, so the files back will have the same names for each setting, but they don't look identical. Okay, they're going to look a little bit different. In the screenshot I'm showing you on the screen right now, this is just a part of what the utility would provide to the installer, and this should be actually posted publicly. We do not expect utilities to have more than one URP, okay? In your technical requirements, you have a generic requirement of what you want to see the settings in your inverters to be. That does not change from installation to installation of solar. If for some reason you get a really oddball, large scale solar installation and it's going to cause certain issues, we might, in the interconnection agreement, write in why their settings should be different. But for 99.99% of the time, you're going to have one URP that applies for all types of interconnections that you get that are inverter based on your system. We also do not expect that utilities will be changing their setting requirements year by year, okay? We do recommend that your technical requirements be reviewed on an annual basis, but typically we're not going to be changing the setting points of these different settings unless we're being dictated by a higher authority, okay? Again, you'll have as utilities, these settings should be up publicly available for installers to see. And for those of you that use Nova, there's a spot for it. Okay. From that, see right here, this is how I would put, that's what we usually have for Nova. From that, utilities, if they want, can also post an empty URP for the installers to download and to hand enter. So if you're going to do that in Nova, you're going to have a URPSS with your settings specified. And you could also put in another file here in the document library that is URP for installers. So the AS version, where basically you're going to have it blank. And what that would look like is something like this. So this is the installer file as applied settings, so the AS version that you could post on your Nova site where they could hand enter settings. Now, most manufacturers of inverters have plans that installers would be able to export out the settings from their inverters. Microinverters, the manufacturer could probably provide it to them today. Centralized inverters, it just really depends on what manufacturer they're using. Some of them have already embedded the ability to create a URP out of their interface software. Others have it in progress, but they might have to go through a firmware update for them to actually have it available for installers to use. In the interim time, installers could be populating this document right here. Okay, and it's really this column B that needs to be populated where they tell us, well, what do you have for all of this information? Okay. Prior to the witness test, it is the installer's responsibility to not only let us know that, hey, I'm ready for my witness test or my commissioning by turning in their certification of completion, but then they also should be providing to the utility the CSV file of their URP's applied settings, okay? That needs to be done at least a couple days prior to the witness test because the utility needs time to actually do a comparison of what settings were actually put into the inverters compared to what the utility actually was asking to be set. Okay. Again, in the near future, pretty much all inverter manufacturers should be able to just provide an export. It may take some time for this to happen, and in the interim time for that automated export to occur, that CSV file I just had up, that needs to be manually entered. And one of the fields in that manually entered thing is the serial number of the inverter itself. When it comes to multiple inverters being installed at a location, we only need one. We only need one URP back. Here's why. If an installer accidentally programs different settings into the different inverters, there's going to be issues with that solar system actually operating anyhow, and they're going to probably have to troubleshoot it. So we only want to see one URP file back, an export out of one inverter. But we also do want to see nameplates, pictures of all the inverters that are there. And most utilities, when you're doing your witness test, your commissioning, you're probably also checking the nameplates on the inverters if you can access them. And you're probably taking pictures for your records anyways. Okay. We do know that populating the URP manually for the applied settings can lead to some human errors. This is recommended, it's not required. When a utility goes out and does their witness test, you might want to spot check one or two settings if they're able to Bluetooth into the inverters so you can actually see those settings. Key ones to look at in my mind is a lot of the technical requirements today are now requiring volt var, power control instead of power factor. So that might be one to say, okay, show me that power factor is disabled and volt var is enabled. You don't necessarily need to go through all the different set points after that. There are other easy ones that you can look at too, but you don't need to walk through every single one if they've already provided you the CSV. But if it's a manual entered one and you just want to do some spot checks, that might be an easy way to do that. So why do we have these URPs? There are so many different screenshots from the software to interface with inverters. And there's so many different apps, if you're going to Bluetooth into inverter, that it really is impossible for the utility to stay on top of every single brand that's out there. Okay. The idea behind the URP is to streamline the review process for the utility to make sure that the settings were properly done. Prior to 2018, when IEEE 1547 was only the 2013 version, there's a lot less settings that the utility cared about. Okay, it was pretty much, okay, are you doing constant power factor? And then are you waiting your 5 minutes after an outage before it comes back on? Otherwise, we just basically told the inverters that any sort of system interruption, please trip off and stay off. Today, with the new IEEE 1547 2018, we're asking inverters to do a lot more. And that's why there's a lot more settings that need to be put in there, and they do need to be reviewed because the utility is expecting these devices to actually work as specified. Okay. CSVs are easy to do comparisons to. okay? And that's one quick way that we can automate the review of settings is if we have the installers actually provide their URPs to us prior to the actual commissioning test. So let's just talk through what it kind of would look like in an actual application process. So most utilities have asked after January 1st of this year that their technical requirements now include settings from IEEE 1547 2018 version that are more advanced. With that, then, as an installer says, I am ready to be interconnected with my solar system, the DER installer then would submit their certification of completion, and then they're also going to submit their URP applied settings file to the utility. Okay? The utility has multiple options here. If you want to just go one by one and look at all the settings, that's great. That's kind of hard on the eyes. You can use a CSV comparator. There's some free ones online. Just be aware that if you're uploading it online, that data becomes then possibly accessed by whoever's running that free comparator. You can also purchase CSV comparators that then sit on your desktop. Or if you have the time, you can also create in Excel, basically a function using the index and match function in Excel that will find those settings and it will apply it to your utility specified settings file. And so it's a quick way to identify what settings are set correctly or where you might have differences in setting features. So here's an example of a file that I did receive from an installer here about a week ago. They're using Alt Energy Power microinverters. And the CSV file that I got back actually listed every single microinverter, which was a little bit different, but that's fine. The only other thing that was a little odd about the file that I got is their settings were listed out horizontal versus vertical. Well, that's a pretty easy Excel function that you can flip it around. So I can have my settings in column B and my setting name in column A. Okay. So as I was doing this, I happened to use the Excel index and match function. I did find some minor changes that were not matching what the utility specified. So the utility specified settings are over on your left-hand side, and then the applied settings that I got back from the installer were on the right-hand side. So some things to note. In the utilities specified settings, we have all of our settings listed in a per unit setting. So it doesn't say on a 240 volt scale or a 480 volt scale, is per unit. So you do need to do a little bit of math to make sure that when you're comparing to what you got back from the installer, specifically when it comes to voltage, that they're usually going to provide it to you in either the 120, 240, 480 scale. And so you need to make sure that's been corrected. So as an example, my enter service voltage low set point on my specified settings, I have it at 0.917. Okay. What I got back from the installer though said it's at 220.08. Well, they're correct because if you do the math, if you do the 0.197 times 240, because they're on a 240 volt inverter, I also get the 220.08 setting or limit. So that is correct, but just be aware, especially when it comes to voltage, we have in our specified settings, everything is in a per unit basis. So you're gonna have to just do some conversions. However, as I gone through all those other settings, I did find out that I asked for the randomized delay to be actually turned off or disabled. And what I got back from the installer is they have it turned on. Okay, so I'm just noting that, okay, this setting needs to be changed. In another area, as I was going through comparing the specified settings and the applied settings, we found just one setting that was off. So this is dealing with tripping due to over and under voltage section. Again, on my left, I've got the specified settings from the utility. Again, it's in per unit. Kind of in the middle are the settings that I got back from the inverter, the applied settings. And then on the far right-hand side there, all I'm showing is the utility specified settings, but put into a 240 base, so it's a little bit easier to compare. And what you'll see is they had every single setting correct, except for the over voltage first trip limit. Instead of having it set to 2 seconds in length, as I required from the utility, for some reason it was set at 13 seconds, okay? So as you find these different things, you then send notification back to the installer saying that, hey, we've got some problems with your inverters. Can you please make these corrections so that, you know, the randomized delay was disabled? Can you please make sure that your trip time isn't 13 seconds, but 2 seconds? And then just send me a new updated applied setting file back once those corrections are done, and we can schedule the witness test. Okay, so again, you're going to want to make sure those applied settings CSV files come to you, you know, at least a couple days, if not a week prior to scheduling your inspection test, your commissioning or witness test, because you do want to make sure you have time to check it. And if you do find something wrong, then you're providing the installer time to make those changes too. So with the URPs, other than finding the utilities actually posting their settings up on their website, whether it be Nova or whatnot, you can also publish your settings at a DER settings website that EPRI has set up. And the idea behind it was EPRI wants all the utilities to start sharing what their settings are, because then manufacturers might be considering making profiles specific to either large utilities or for actual regions. An example of this is in California with their new net metering setting. When you incorporate a storage system, you do not want to see export out onto the grid. They actually get a better rate of return on a solar plus storage system in California if they make sure all of the production stays at that home. Okay, so there's a certain setup of settings that it makes sense for those inverters in California to be set at. Manufacturers know that that's a big market. They then create a specific California setting that kind of goes through and it populates everything. Those of you in the Midwest, most have pretty much the same set of settings, especially if you're underneath the MISO jurisdiction, because MISO is one of the ISOs in the nation that is requiring Cat 3 for inverter settings during abnormal conditions, which is something different than a lot of the other regional transmission operators, okay? But the more that we actually populate our settings in this website, and it is free, the more that manufacturers know what utilities are requiring in different areas. So that's something that you might want to look out for. Okay, so when I've been talking with a lot of utilities about URPs, there has been some questions about, well, how do I, the utility, actually interpret what these settings are actually doing? And there is a interpretation file, basically. It's a URP that not only shows you in the first column, here is the names that everybody's going by. This is where second columns where the utility populates their stuff. But then the third and fourth columns are actually talking about, well, what is this line actually trying to say? That document, if you would like to see it, we do have it set up for multiple states. After this presentation, please feel free to send me an email and I can share it. And what we'll share is here's an example of what the utility does on the specified settings. And it'll have all of the kind of key descriptions of what that setting is. But then we'll also provide you the, what we would expect to see back from the installer. Again, this middle section is not filled in, but this would be the you would separate these two tabs apart and you could put the installer applied settings also up on your Novo website. Again, we know there's a lot of questions about, well, when is everybody going to have the ability to just export out their settings from their inverter manufacturer software? We don't know. From conversations that I've had with the bigger brands that we do see throughout at least the Midwest, they're able to do it. What they're struggling with is sometimes when they do an update to their software, it may or may not require them to go through recertification of their inverter. And so that is slowing some of it down. But the use of URPs is not only located to the Midwest. We actually are seeing this in a lot of other states as it's the most efficient way for installers to communicate to utilities how they've set up their inverters and how to keep track of it. Okay. So before we go into the question and answer session, I do want to just bring up some common things that I've heard and just to address them as a group so they get on the recording. So first thing I usually hear is, okay, somebody provided me hand-entered URP, so it's in this format, they put in the settings, they provided it, was not an actual export out of the inverter. Number one, how do I know that that inverter actually was set with those settings? Okay, again, I would do a spot check. When you go out there to do your witness test, just ask to see one or two settings just to confirm that it actually is put into that setting and it's not, they're not using settings from a different state. Number two is the follow-up question is how do I know those settings won't change in the future? Do I ask for a URP on a regular basis? The answer right now is no. We basically only want the URP submitted to us prior to the interconnection. You're not going to ask for updated settings, whether they change or not, as we go year to year, because there has to be some sort of trust factor between you and your consumer. You do reserve the right, though, as a utility, if there becomes an issue with power quality that you're trying to troubleshoot, you can request at that point in time from the owner of the system to provide you, what you currently have programmed into your settings. At that point in time, you can then compare. Just keep in mind though, it is very possible that the settings that you're using today might change 5 or 10 years from now, just because as different things come up or higher penetration. The DER installers only have to follow the current technical requirements that you have in place at the time of application. The DER owner, then the homeowner or the business owner, they do not need to continually update their DERs as your technical requirements change. It's only at the point of at the time of interconnection. So my 2024 technical requirements still apply even if I'm looking at their inverter for their settings in 2028. I'm not going to ask them to update them. Okay. If they add to their system, that's a little bit different of a story, because when you add on to your system, you want the entire system to try to at least be having all the same settings. And we usually would request that they update to the latest and greatest technical requirements at that point in time.